Quick note before the episode begins. On this new series of the Aequi podcast, we are going to be passing the mic over to some of our colleagues from our department so that they can share with you the interesting EU projects that we work on.
But don't worry, Tima and I are not going away. We'll be back soon. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to Aequi, the podcast on all things on law and technology. I'm Mariana.
And I'm Michael.
And welcome to another episode on the Pass the Mic series, where we discuss the European Union Horizon 2020 funded project, the Virtual Brain Cloud. First, let us thank Tim and Paul for passing the mic and allowing in this space to talk about the BBC project, as we call it. We are very honored to be part of this podcast series, really. And before we dive into the topic, we can do a brief introductory round so the audience know who is who on this side of the mic this time. So, Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Mariana. So thank you also from my side, Tima and Paul. Here's a little FYI on myself. My name is Michael or Michael Cepic. I'm a research associate here at the department and involved in two projects. One is known as the Virtual Brain Cloud, and which is going to be the main topic today, as well as Biomap, which is another research project. In my personal research, I focus on data protection in the judicial system, as well as biotechnology law. What about you?
Okay, from my side, as I already introduced myself, my name is Mariana Riseto. I'm also a research associate since 2019 in the department. I'm also working in projects related mainly in health, specifically the Brain Cloud project, and also was working in Biomap, but also contributed in UN-related projects, and I'm also currently working on privacy for kids. So after, I think that getting to know a little bit each other and knowing the who is who today, shall we dive into today's topic, Michael? So do you want to tell us a little bit about the project?
So the Virtual Brain Cloud project is a Horizon 2020 funded project, with its goal being personalized prevention and treatment of dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's. To scale results down to the individual patient level, the Virtual Brain Cloud integrates the data of large cohorts of patients and healthy controls through multi-scale brain simulation using the Virtual Brain Simulator. There is a need for infrastructures for sharing and processing health data at a large scale that comply with the EU General Data Protection Regulations, or as we abbreviated, the GDPR. The Virtual Brain Cloud tries to close this gap, making health data actionable. Data protection concepts minimize the risk for data subjects and allow scientists to use sensitive data for research and clinical translation, which is one of our main tasks. Would you give us some numbers and a little more information on other partners, Mariana?
Sure. So, for example, to illustrate the footprint of what the prospective results of this project would be, perhaps it's important for us to visualize that the annual worldwide cost of Alzheimer's dementia was 777.81 billion euros in 2015. Yes, I have to read that. And it's foreseen that this number will raise to 7.41 trillion euros in 2050. Quite huge numbers. So early diagnosis is actually calculated to save up more than 7.9 trillion euros by 2050. So I think with these numbers that we brought into the room today, we can see that the importance of these prospective results of the project. And this is, I think, why the BBC is a joint effort of, we are 17 partners from across Europe. This includes 12 research institutions, sorry for the pause, a supercomputer center, 4 small media size enterprises, and 1 patient organization. Also, perhaps it's due to note that the project lead is Petra Ritter, a neuroscientist from Charité. So we are an interdisciplinary team that covers different fields. This is medicine, ICT, legal, and ethical. Talking about participation in the project, there are also external links and connections. The project works together with Indoor Research, a Canadian non-for-profit organization which has been contracted for technical coordination of the project. Plus, the BBC is a partner project of a European flagship project, the Human Brain, with its e-brain infrastructure, eBrains. Additionally, the BBC is actually participating in the European open source cloud, and we must not forget that the project is supported by the technical and legal and ethical advisory boards, which are reached out on a case-by-case basis and consulting from a sustainable expert advice on specific aspects. So, right, we talk about the relevance of the project and its composition. So it's time to look, I think, to our role. When we look at our role, we're in a legal and ethical supporting role. So, Michael, how do you describe in deep our role, and what do you find it interesting?
I would say our role is twofold. So on the one hand, we are there to counsel or assist or advise other partners when they have questions regarding the law, in particular, in our case, data protection law and intellectual property law. And on the other hand, we do our own legal research. And that's also, of course, the most interesting part. As we identify a legal question in the course of the project that has not been answered so far or not sufficiently, and then if we find the time to go into depth here, we will usually discuss this among the group, sometimes even among the whole department. And then we'll decide in which way we do the research and use the results. And that's usually either through a publication or a podcast. And coming back to the consulting part, one of our biggest tasks is to make sure that the virtual brain cloud already integrates data protection laws in the development stage, so as a project develops. And this is known as data protection by design. And at the moment, and if I look at the past, this is where most questions arise from. And for this, we also have established a legal help desk. And so on the one hand, we have planned work according to the grant agreement, so which it's like an agenda. And on the other hand, we have short notice inquiries to work on that are brought to our attention, for example, via the just described help desk. Would you like to add anything on that point?
Yes, in my personal experience, I think one of the most challenging parts is, and therefore I would say interesting parts, is translating the law into practice. Having these interdisciplinary teams makes this challenge for us as lawyers to translate it in words that are understandable for non-lawyers. So we talk about our role, and therefore perhaps it would be also good for the audience to understand a little bit how we put our role into a product, an outcome, and perhaps it would be nice if you, Michael, can describe what we need to deliver and produce within the project. Mm-hmm.
So derived from this twofold role, which is, again, on the one hand, assistance, advice, and on the other hand, our own legal research, we're expected to deliver legal research results as well as legal recommendations. And in research projects like ours, like the VBC, this is usually done via so-called deliverables. So these are documents of, depending who is drafting it, documents of medical, technical, or in our case, legal nature that describe a research task and the findings. And depending on the nature, they are either confidential or public, meaning that you can access them or not. So, and our initial, at that time, was confidential deliverable, was on the legal framework, in particular data protection law, that would pertain to the VBC. And maybe to have a look out, our final deliverable will be a follow-up on this and will describe how we dealt with legal issues. So we outlined the legal framework, and then we'll describe how this was implemented in the project. And furthermore, we have to include best practices and industry standards, and we'll report on legal developments in this field. And these deliverables, they will need to be accepted by the project's consortium, which is basically the other partners, and in the long run by the European Commission. And depending on the grant agreement, a project partner may also be tasked to deliver through other means. We, for example, also hosted a GDPR conference about bridging the gap between health research and the protection of personal data. It is in our discretion to also disseminate our results via other means like conferences or webinars. Do you have anything more here?
Yeah, perhaps it's just in terms of deliverables, it could be really interesting for the audience just to say that this deliverables scheme is quite similar across European funded projects. And I think we have already mentioned this in the last two podcasts for Pro Cancer and the FSM. So perhaps the audience are already acquainted about that. But perhaps just to pick up on the last 2 points that you mentioned on dissemination, specifically one, on dissemination, that's the conference and the webinar. So just to do a little bit of advertising here too, we had the conference and the webinar recordings that are public in YouTube, and we will put it in the description of the podcast. So it's also available for you. Also, perhaps it's interesting for the audience to know that we support partners in other deliverables, in their deliverables, for example, by creating the data management plan or assessing and helping providing a legal framework applicable to the cloud services in terms specifically to security. Just perhaps to sum up and to make this clear, what do you think are the main points and topics of our research, and what kind of challenges are entangled in these topics, Michael?
Well, I would say the overarching goal and topic includes the balancing between enabling researchers, or in the end, the virtual brain cloud as a project, to process personal or often the case, sensitive data, while at the same time guaranteeing a high level of data protection as required by the GDPR. Furthermore, we also collaborate with Alzheimer Europe, which is a non-profit patient organization, to make sure that ethical concerns are taken into account as well, paying special attention to the patient perspective. I would say that from a legal point of view, GDPR implementation and interpretation is one of the biggest topics. So this includes broad consent, anonymization of health data, and identification of medical images, roles of partners according to the GDPR, so either processor or controller. Then also data security, certification, and codes of conduct. So these are our key research and advice points. Do you think I missed anything?
No, I don't think. I fully agree with the main points that you made. Perhaps I would only add one kind of end product that we developed that was a kind of GDPR and ethical compliance checklist that we provided the partners. I thought this is a really good practical tool for the partners to understand when and how the GDPR applies and what to consider if they are processing personal data. I thought about going through the 7 steps that we mentioned, but I think this is going to be kind of overwhelming to the audience. But basically what we did was to provide the 7 steps. The first one, like for example, the first one with a title, like assessing the type of data that they are processing, and then coming to a question, like for example, what type of data is the one that you're processing? Do you think that it's personal data, is non-personal data? It's anonymous, it's pseudonymized. Of course, partners are always advised to check with cross-check with their data protection officer if there is one available at their research institution to see that these concepts are the concepts used in the GDPR. And basically, this is what the product that we develop, and I think this was quite a good tool, practical tool. And I think additionally, and coming back to the points that you made, you mentioned identifying the roles of partners in the light of GDPR, right? Mm-hmm. So one of those was actually also to provide some contract templates, specifically when we look at joint controllerships and controlling and processing agreement templates to be to put in place with the sole aim of sharing personal data within the project. So controller is defined in Article 24 of the GDPR, and this is specifically a legal or a natural person who makes the decision how the data is going to be used. A processor is basically the one that is also a legal or natural person who is processing data on behalf of the controller.
Yeah, and I think it's also for a difficulty for us, right? Sometimes to identify these roles in the partners.
Clearly, this is something that, although it's quite clear, the definition brought in the GDPR and also with the complementing guidelines interpreting these concepts, I do think that when you look into practice, this is not that easy to identify. Agree. So perhaps also, and I think another challenge that we have is also the data sharing. And so do you want to mention some of the things that we encounter when we either think about data sharing already doing the sharing of personal data?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's often very hard to tell if a data set includes just personal data or sensitive data as well, as in our case, like brain data or health data in general, which merits higher protection and therefore has different implications when sharing them. And we find that the legal basis for processing is also sometimes difficult to identify. We very often use public interest in the form of scientific research, which requires to also, in the case of, especially in the case of sensitive data, to consult national law. And here we oftentimes need to collaborate with other legal departments of partners in the end to make sure we understand the national law properly. Another issue more on the factual than the legal side is that while this legal perspective may even be easy to solve, the data flow remains unclear, which is why we must develop which partner is going to share which data on what legal basis to which other partner. So you see these are a couple of questions involved. Yes.
And if I may, I think exactly, I mean, in particular to this project, we have actually sorted out. There's already kind of a data flow identified, and thanks, of course, to all the partners who collaborated with that. So perhaps just a quick note on the current status.
Absolutely. And then resulting from this assessment, we can then recommend the appropriate documents. The documents you just described, which is a joint controllership agreement or controller-processor agreement. But collecting this information often comes across difficult. Another issue arising from the transnational nature of these research projects is that we see ourselves encountered with questions of the scope of application of laws, in particular the territorial scope. This means the necessity to assess whether for a specific data sharing process the GDPR is applicable and what it means for the partners. Would you recall any other issue that's important to mention at this point?
Well, first I have to say this is kind of a Pandora box of legal challenges. That's a fact. But I think if you ask me now, I think another issue with sharing is when you have incoming data to the project that stems from non-European Union countries. So this could be a problem, right?
Yes. So if we look at the law, according to Article 3, Section 1 GDPR, the GDPR applies to the processing of personal data in the context of the activities of an establishment of a controller. So again, that's the one who determines the means and purposes of a processing, or the establishment of a processor, and that's again the natural legal person who processes on behalf of a controller in the union. And that's regardless of whether the processing takes place in the European Union or not. So in short, since more or less all the project partners are situated in the EU, the GDPR will likely always apply to their processing of personal data. Now, when personal data comes in from a non-EU country like the United States, we are encountered with the question whether the processing by a partner is initial processing or whether we can determine this to be further processing with slightly different legal consequences. For example, for the determination of the legal basis for that processing activity.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, as I mentioned before, the project is working with the Human Brain Project and eBrains, and this has specific connections and data incoming from US. So that's why this challenge was important for us to research further. Okay, yeah, something else that I wanted to tell you is that the other interrelated aspect that we have here in the project is the cloud service, right? Because the project is developing a cloud infrastructure. So one of the things that come up quite often was the security legal framework that we should implement in the project. So we worked a little bit on this. And can you tell me again the status quo in regard to the legal instruments that apply regarding security in cloud services?
Oh, I can try.
Thank you.
So in general, I think what makes cloud services so special in terms of their legal dimension is their distributed nature. So as a consequence, we need to take into account, for example, that the provider of the infrastructure, for example, supercomputing centers, are situated in the best case in an EU country, in France, while the cloud service provider is located in Germany. But this could, of course, be different. It could be in India or in the United States or in any country. Now, the GDPR, in its Article 32, requires controllers to set up security measures appropriate to the risk. And in a cloud environment processing health-related data, like the VBC, sensitive data are processed that require, again, the highest standard of security. Usually, the initial step is to perform a data protection impact assessment to see what kind of risks can be identified and which measures could mitigate these risks. As this is very individual, guidelines might help, but would need to be specific to the field to be practically relevant. So probably we would need guidelines on the processing in neuroscience projects or something like this.
Well, that would be another project.
Yes, that would be certainly another project. And yeah, but anyway, the decision to identify these security measures is an interdisciplinary one, with the final vote given by the technical partners. As part of the virtual brain cloud, we were collaborating in particular with Fraunhofer, it's another research institution, to identify the concrete measures, and were able to publish our initial assessment on the relevant legal framework in the European Data Protection Law Review. So it was quite an effort to collect all the relevant laws pertaining to such an infrastructure. Would you like to go into details somewhere here, Mariana?
Yes, indeed. It was quite a hard work, and I think it would be also interesting for the audience to hear a little bit more about this. So basically, we have the question: what is the security level that needs to be achieved by cloud services providers, in the healthcare sector in order to satisfactorily address privacy and security concerns? So in order to achieve this, we started by mapping the applicable legal framework to cloud computing. And here we noticed that it's composed of different legal instruments which attain the protection and regulation of these two subject matters, specifically privacy and security. But at the present, there is no legal instrument at the European Union level which targets cloud computing per se, with only one exception, the NIS directive, which regulates the cloud computing service as one of the type of services under the purposes of point 5 of Article 4. And here we identify 3 areas relevant for security requirements set up by law. The first one, we talk about this the whole podcast, and this is data protection. And at the European level, we have the GDPR. And specifically, we looked into Article 32. And the second one is the healthcare sector. Here, we haven't found a European Union level legal instrument which harmonize any kind of security requirements. And the third point was the cybersecurity sector. And here we have 2 directives, and this is the NIS directive and the cybersecurity one, which, yes, identifies certain security requirements and standards harmonized across the European Union. Basically, I think I will not go into details on what the requirements are, because I think we are way past our timing for the podcast. But I think these main elements are really important to note. Plus, of course, soft law. And here we had identified at least 3 that are important to take into consideration when we think about security requirements for cloud computing. So is there anything that I forgot to mention here?
Well, I think in the context of security, and since you just raised soft law, I think codes of conduct or best practices could make the selection of certain security measures easier, but are largely missing. And we therefore, for example, in this project, reached out to external stakeholders and will be working to at least maybe start the process in our community of discussing these topics with others that also encounter these problems, to maybe start, cast the first stone and maybe start some initiatives here for our field. Yeah.
True. So we can see that there are many questions coming from us to research on, which we are really happy about. And for example, we start with what legal framework applies to cloud, what the territorial and material scope of GDPR is, how the roles of GDPR are assigned among the partners and within them, what are the legal bases for really kind of simple questions, but challenging ones too, what are the legal bases for processing personal data for research purposes. So all of those, as I mentioned already, are doing a really kind of challenging but interesting and I think motivating work. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you have any final thoughts in this context?
Well, importantly, I would say we need to understand the law, and in our case, mostly data protection law, not an end in itself, but rather a means to guarantee that people's data are cautiously used in the digital age, especially keeping in mind the fundamental law implications of the right to private life and data protection. But at the same time, we must also see the benefits of data-driven research and what it entails for the society. And I think the balancing becomes especially prominent in the health sector, where data are generally of particular sensitive nature, but the results from their use may be especially useful to human society. In this, some may call it conflict, the application of the law, balancing on the fundamental level the right to privacy and the right to health, as well as the freedom of research, becomes particularly important. I see our role in making the research endeavors possible while making sure that they comply with the law. As we are publicly funded, I also see it as one of our main tasks to communicate our results to the public, which in the end invested into this project.
Yes, I think basically all you say I agree. But just the last 2 points kind of strike me, and specifically this striking the balance between how prominent is in the health sector is going to be, and the data and the sensitive nature is key, and also the output that it has to be publicly available. And I think that's the whole aim of these kind of projects, right? So I think that's all from our side. First, thank you, Michael. It's, I have to say, a pleasure to work with you in the project. And thank you, the audience, for listening. This was Mariana.
Yeah, and this was Michael.
taking over the Aequi podcast presenting the Virtual Brain Cloud project. So feel free to check out the link below where we have the project website and the links to the conference webinar on data protection related topics.
And maybe the last point, thanking Paul and Tima again, or Tim and Paul, for allowing us to be on their stage for once. Yes. Goodbye. Adios.
Adios.